Chapter 1. The First Verse. The amber glow of Edison bulbs cast long shadows across the cramped interior of the last page, transforming the independent bookstore into something almost sacred. Alara clutched her worn notebook against her chest, her heart hammering as she surveyed the intimate gathering. Mercier chairs formed a loose semicircle around a small wooden stage that was really just a raised platform Julian had cobbled together from old crates and plywood. She twisted the silver ring on her finger, a nervous habit she'd never quite shaken, and counted the faces in the dim light. Maybe 15 people, all those she recognized from her shifts at the cafe down the street. This was her third time at the weekly poetry open mic, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she had verses that burned in her chest, words that demanded to be spoken aloud. Next up, we have Alara, called Marcus, the bearded graduate student who organized these gatherings. His voice carried the easy confidence of someone comfortable with being the center of attention. Alara's legs felt unsteady as she approached the makeshift stage, but she forced herself to move. The notebook fell open in her hands to pages covered in her messy handwriting, crossed out lines, and coffee stains. She found the poem she'd finished just that morning, raw verses about longing and the ache of being 19 and feeling like she was drowning in possibilities she couldn't quite grasp. "This is called Hunger," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, before she caught herself and spoke louder. It's about wanting something you can't name." From the back of the room, leaning against a towering shelf of philosophy texts, Julian Blackwood watched her with the intensity of a man studying a rare manuscript. At 42, he cut an imposing figure even in his casual flannel shirt and worn jeans. Salt and pepper hair fell across his forehead, and those dark eyes that had seen too much and given away too little, never left her face. Alara began to read, her voice growing stronger with each line. "I am appetite without object, a mouth that opens to swallow moonlight, hands that reach for shadows because substance feels too dangerous." The words poured from her like water from a broken dam. She spoke of sleepless nights and the weight of dreams that felt too big for her small-town existence. She spoke of breakups that left craters and the terrifying freedom of not knowing what came next. The cafe patrons and local artists listened with the polite attention of a practiced audience, but Julian heard every syllable like it was being carved into his bones. "I want to be devoured by something worthy of the feast, to find hunger that matches mine and lose myself in the feeding." When she finished, the applause was warm but brief. Alara stepped down from the stage, her cheeks flushed and her pulse racing with the familiar high of having exposed her soul to strangers. She made her way toward the back of the room, intending to slip out early as she usually did, when a deep voice stopped her. "That was extraordinary." She turned to find Julian standing closer than she'd expected, close enough as she could catch the scent of cedar and old books that seemed to cling to him. This close, she could see the laugh lines around his eyes and the way his intense gaze seemed to look right through her careful facades. "Thank you," she managed, suddenly hyper-aware of how young she must seem to him. "I wasn't sure. I mean, it's pretty raw." "The best poetry always is." His voice was like aged whiskey, smooth and warm with just enough bite to make you want more. Raw honesty is what separates art from mere craft. Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. This wasn't the polite encouragement she usually received from the other open mic regulars. This felt different, charged with an undercurrent she couldn't quite name but definitely felt. "You know poetry," she said, more observation than question. A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I should hope so. I have a doctorate in comparative literature gathering dust somewhere." "And now you run a bookstore." She gestured around them at the towering shelves that seemed to hold every book ever written. "Now I run a bookstore," he agreed. "Sometimes the quieter life calls louder than the prestigious one." There was a story there, layers of meaning hidden beneath his casual words. But before Lara could probe deeper, Julian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that somehow made him look both more distinguished and more approachable. "Have you ever seen a first edition Plath?" he asked suddenly. What?" "Sylvia Plath, Ariel, 1965. I have a copy in the back room. The binding alone is a work of art." Alara's breath caught. She knew what he was really asking, could feel the electricity crackling between them like a live wire. The rational part of her mind whispered warnings about older men and complications she wasn't prepared for, but that voice was drowned out by something much more primal. "I'd love to see it," she heard herself say. The crowd around them was beginning to thin as the evening wound down, people gathering coats and heading back out into the October night. Julian led her through a maze of bookshelves toward the back of the store, past sections labeled local authors and rare finds, until they reached a heavy wooden door marked private. The back room was smaller than she'd expected, lined with glass-fronted cases containing books that looked older than the town itself. But Alara barely registered the literary treasures surrounding her because Julian had turned to face her, and the intensity in his dark eyes made her knees weak. "Alara," he said, her name sounding like poetry in his deep voice. "Are you sure you want to be here?" Instead of answering with words, she stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. The notebook slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. "Show me the book," she whispered, but they both knew she wasn't talking about Plath anymore. What happened next was inevitable, like gravity or the changing of seasons. Julian's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone as if she were something precious and fragile. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other, the weight of possibility hanging between them. Then his mouth was on hers, and Alara discovered that all her poetry about hunger had been mere practice for this moment. His kiss was nothing like the fumbling attempts of boys her own age. This was confident and demanding and absolutely devastating. Her hands fisted in his flannel shirt, pulling him closer as he backed her against one of the glass cases. "We shouldn't," he started to say against her lips, but she silenced him with another kiss, this one bold enough to make him groan low in his throat. "I'm 19, not a child," she breathed against his mouth, "and I want this. I want you." Something snapped in Julian at her words. His careful control crumbled like old parchment, and suddenly his hands were everywhere, tangling in her dark hair, sliding beneath her soft sweater, mapping the curves of her body like a man discovering a new continent. The dusty back room became their entire universe. Books and propriety forgotten, they lost themselves in each other with a desperation that surprised them both. Alara had never felt so alive, every nerve ending singing as Julian worshipped her body with a reverence that made her feel like the rarest of manuscripts. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together on the old Persian rug, both breathing hard and slightly stunned by the intensity of what had just happened, Julian traced lazy patterns on Alara's bare shoulder. "This is insane," he murmured, his voice rough with satisfaction and growing concern. "The best things usually are," she replied, echoing his earlier words about poetry. But even as she spoke, Alara could see the walls beginning to rebuild themselves behind his eyes. The morning would bring harsh light and harsher realities. The 23-year age gap, the small-town gossip mill, the complications of a respected businessman becoming involved with a teenage barista. For now, though, they had this moment. This perfect, impossible, absolutely devastating moment that would change everything that came after. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows at the last page, but inside, surrounded by thousands of love stories written by others, Alara and Julian were busy creating their own.